All right, Rabbi, say good morning. An incredible. The problem is too much good Torah, too little time. That's really the problem. Baruch Hashem. All right, let's begin. So I want to begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Czinn Teri Kahn Czinn, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in honor of the birth of their first grandson, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, Benjamin and Elys Wohl, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in honor of all those who helped to make this shiur possible, including Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson. To thank Shimmy Batsheva Messing for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in honor of the Bas Mitzva of their daughter Lilah, and to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah bas Avrohom, Tziril bas Rav Dov. Also to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for the Parak Pesachim, Moishe and Abramson, for dedicating the Parak in this Chus of Refuah Shlema for Daniel Meir ben Chana, and Said and Sima Haken, in honor of the ability to return to Shir Baruch Hashem in a safe way. And we want to welcome Said back. Baruch Hashem, Said, you have always been a pillar of the shul and a pillar of this shir, and it is so incredibly wonderful to welcome you back in person. Baruch haba. Baruch haba. All right, I'll say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Kuf Tes Zayin, 116, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis, 115b. We have a lot to do today. We are picking up an Amar of Shimmy Batsheva, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. Amar of Shimmy Batsheva. Rav Shimmy Batsheva said as follows: Matz lifnei kol echad ve'echad, mar lifnei kol echad ve'echad, charos lifnei kol echad ve'echad. So Rav Shimmy Batsheva says that at the seder, essentially what you do is you put a seder plate in front of each person. Right? Every person gets their own matzah, every person gets their own maror, and every person gets their own charoses. Good, simple idea. Now, the truth is, as we mentioned before many times, this also makes sense in terms of how their meal was set up. Because remember, again, they would eat on smaller private tables, right? On small private tables. So remember, Ashi says everybody has their own stuff. Tosas points out that the reason for this is just to allow for consumption more immediately, right? So again, this way you make hamotzi, you make motzi matzah, everybody can eat immediately. You make alachilas maror, you could eat immediately. Everything could be done with a greater degree of immediacy. Fine. However, both said we know that at certain points in the Seder, we move the table. Now, the truth is we don't move the table. What we do is what? We remove the Seder plate. So what we call removing the Seder plate, they called moving the table. So Rav Bar Ashi says, as much as everyone has their own Seder plate, so to speak, but when we remove the Seder plate, when we remove the table, that's only before the Baal Haggadah, the one who is reciting the Haggadah. Rav Huna Amar, no, Kulu Nam Lefnei Misha Amar Haggadah. Rav Huna says, not true. We don't give matzah, maror, and charoses to every person. Rather, again, matzah, maror, charoses is only placed in front of the person who is leading the Seder. The Hilchasa, ki Rav Huna, and the Halacha is like Rav Huna. I will say that interestingly enough, there are different minhagim when it comes to this. Right? Some people do have the minhag that let's say you're having a seder with multiple mishpachos. So some do have a minhag that every kind of, I'll call it familial patriarch has their own seder plate. There are minhagim like that, but the Gemara seems to indicate that the general minhag is that there's one seder plate that is placed in front of the Baal HaSeder. Good. Lama okrenes hashulchan. Why do we uproot the table? Which I will say again, remember, which for our purposes means why at certain intervals at the Seder do we remove the Seder plate? Amri debe Rabbi Yana kadeshi akiru tinokos v'yishalu. So Rabbi Yana says, again, Rabbi Yana said, children should ask. I will say, remember again, the entire essence of the Seder is ki yishalcha bincha machar lemar maha avoda azos lachem. The goal is a whole interesting idea with the Seder is that the Seder is supposed to be question-answer. That's the whole idea. There's a feeling that ultimately, again, the Seder is more interactive when it's based on questioning as opposed to when it's based on a monologue. Right? So therefore, again, we do, as we've seen already a number of things, that we do simply, again, that look, it's a departure from the norm in order to engender questions. Abai, this is great. Abai Yosef Kamei de Rabba. So Abai was one time sitting by Rabba for Seder. Listen to this. Chaza de Kamad Leitacha Mikamei. So they saw the Seder had begun, and they saw that the servants, right, the Shamas took away the table from in front of Rabba. Amarlu, Abai was surprised. Amarlu, Adai lo ka'achlinon asu. So Abai said, we didn't eat yet. It's just interesting. You have to understand something. You see, we're used to these practices because they are codified in halachic practice. But when these Siddurim were happening, Bismana Gemara, these practices were not codified. So can you imagine this scene? Abai is invited over for Seder at Rabba's house. Rabba's having the Seder. They're starting the Seder. And right at the beginning of the Seder, the Shabbos comes along. The butler comes along. The servant, the waiter comes along and takes away Rabba's table. And Abai says, what's going on over here? We haven't even eaten dinner yet. We haven't had anything to eat. I didn't even get my karpas. I didn't get my 15 potatoes, right? So I didn't even get anything yet. So what's happening over here? You're taking away the table? So Amalei Rabba said, Patrasan mi lower manishtana. Abai shkoyach. Right? Exactly. We don't have to say manishtana now, right? Because the whole point of manishtana is it's choreographed questions, right? It's choreographed. So Rabba said to Abai, oh, excellent. Mission accomplished. You see something very important from this Gemara, which is what? That the Kadesh Yishalu is not just by children, right? The whole idea of the Seder is it's most normal for the children to ask why. Why? Because children are generally more inquisitive by nature. One of the saddest things about reaching adulthood is that sometimes our curiosity goes away. Right? It's an incredible thing, right? When you ever see a child, it's such like a baby, right? And they take hold of something. So what do? They study it, they look at it, they taste it, right? They bend it. Everything is fascinating, right? Every single thing is riveting. They could stare and look at something. Adults, and that's, by the way, that's beautiful because that's the curiosity that pushes us to understand the world. Unfortunately, sometimes as we get older, we lose our curiosity a little bit, which is terrible, which is absolutely terrible, because it's curiosity that pushes us to growth. We kind of just are, whatever, that is what it is. That is what it is. So I'll say, so again, but the idea of Kedei Shishla Tinokos is the children should ask, but the goal is that the adults should get involved in the dialogue as well. So Abai says, hey, what's going on over here? Rabbi says, Shkoyach, mission accomplished, incredible. The Gemara goes like, Shmuel, Lechamoni. Matzah is called lechem oni. So both say, the Gemara says, lechem she'onin alav dvarim. Both say, interestingly enough, according to the first opinion, according to Shmuel, lechem oni is a bread that we speak a lot about, or bread over which much is spoken about, right? Matzah is a conversation piece, right? That's what it is. Matzah sparks an incredible amount of conversation from the beginning of the Seder, right, like the bread of affliction, to Rabbi Gamliel, which we'll get to. Matzah is bread over which many words are said. The Tainam Halcha that supports is lechem oni, lechem she'onin alav devarim harbe. Davra Akar, another possibility is lechem oni, aniksiv. Both say, as much as we vocalize it as lechem oni, the bread of the oni, it's written as ani, which means poverty. So what does that mean? Ma ani shedako beprusa. Just like an ani, sometimes is so impoverished that he doesn't have anything whole. Top of Kuftas Zayin. Afkan beprusa. So too over here by the Pesach Seder, we only utilize a piece of matzah. Rabbi said, remember again, what this is referring to is something very interesting, which is part of our Seder practice. We take 3 matzahs. Yachatz, we break the middle matzah, right? Take the larger half for afikomen. Then when it comes time for motzi matzah, what do? We make 2 brachas. The bracha of hamotzi and the bracha of alachilas matzah. Hamotzi we make holding all, I'll call it 3, 2.5. Right? Then we'll say, what do we do for motzi matzah? For motzi matzah, we let go of the bottom one, right? And we only make motzi matzah on the top whole one and the middle broken one. That's what it means. And why? Why do we do that? Because again, according to this, to satisfy this interpretation, that says lechem oni is ani, the bread of poverty. Therefore, the bread of poverty, the ani is so poor that even a matzah, he doesn't have a whole one. So when we make the birchas hamitzvah, remember again, because hamotzi is a birchas hanenin, a bracha of consumption. Mitzvahs al achilas matzah is a berchas ha-mitzvah, a bracha on the mitzvah of achilas matzah. When we make the berchas ha-mitzvah, we put down one of the whole ones and only use a half and a whole. Why the half? To symbolize the fact that matzah is the bread of poverty and the poor person only has a piece. The other possibility is ma darko shel ani. What does an ani do? Right? An ani goes ahead. Ma darko shel ani. Hu masik v'ishta ofe. So when it comes to an ani, what happens? So often he's going in and firing up the oven, and his wife is baking. So in other words, it's a joint process to prepare bread. Af kanami hu masik v'ishta ofe. So too by matzah, in the preparation of matzah, ultimately again he's firing up the oven and his wife is baking. Now the truth is, by matzah, the reason why both the ani and his wife are involved is why? Because it has to happen faster, right? There can't be a delay. So he's firing up the oven, so that way as soon as the wife is finished kneading the dough, it's ready to go in. Good, beautiful. So we'll say two different interpretations, or really three different interpretations in lechamoni. Quite beautiful. In charoses mitzvahs. We'll say, remember again the Mishnah said, you bring charoses to the table, even though there is no mitzvah of charoses. So the Gemara says, "Ilo mitzvah mishum mai maisi." I don't understand. If there's no mitzvah of charoses, then why are you bringing it to the table? We saw this already in yesterday's daf. Mishum kappa, because we'll say there's some type of kappa. Literally means poison, but there's something harmful in the maror, specifically again in lettuce, and so the charoses neutralizes whatever this poison is. Remember again, whether it's poison, whether it's a worm, two different opinions in the Rashbam. And then again, what we're also seeing is whether the charoses neutralizes it when you dip the maror into it, or maybe it's just the scent, the aroma of the charoses, which kills whatever is harmful in the maror. Ravasi says, by the way, this kappa issue is not just an issue with lettuce. She says, Ravasi, kappa de chasachama, literally again, the cure to the poison or the medicine for the poison in lettuce is a radish. Kappa de chama karsi, the medicine for the poison inside of a radish is a leek or a gourd. Kappa de karsi chamimi, the medicine for the poison inside of a gourd or a leek is warm water. Kappa de kulhu chamimi. Apparently, again, so the Gemara is just saying is apparently all of these vegetables have some type of harmful side effect, and therefore it's kidai to eat these other types of foods after you eat these vegetables. But then the Gemara says something very interesting. Kappa de kulhu chamimi. The truth is, drinking warm water after you eat any of these items is incredibly helpful to neutralize the negative effects of this, what we'll call this kappa. Adahachi vahachi, but while you're looking for hot water to drink after eating this vegetable, you should say the following: kappa, kappa, dakirna lacha, uleshev banseich, uletamni kalasech. Kappa, kappa, I know you, your 7 daughters, and your 8 daughters-in-law. Okay, so again, I will say, when you see things like this goes back to the idea that somehow Chazal felt that whatever the negative force, the kappa, inside of these vegetables, was somehow related to shadim also, right? Whenever you see these incantations, these statements that you're supposed to say, those are always related somehow to shadim ruach ra. Good. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok Omer, mitzvah. So Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said, no, charoses is a mitzvah. Boss says a fascinating machlokes. Charoses is a mitzvah. My mitzvah. What does that mean? Charoses is a mitzvah. So Rabbi Levi Omer, zechel tapuach. It's to remember the apple tree. So we'll say, what's the symbolism with the apple tree? So the Rashbam points out over here, this is truly beautiful. Zechel tapuach b'mesechas sota sheyoldo sham b'neim below eitzav shlei akiro b'hem mitzvah. So we'll say the Gemara Mesechas Sota brings down tachas hatapuach orarticha shir shirim, that the Jewish women would go out into the fields under the apple trees to deliver their babies out of the sight of the Egyptians. So to remember the apple trees under which the Jewish women gave birth, again, to save their babies from being thrown into the Nile. So we go ahead and we have the charoses. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it's to remember the mortar. To remember the mortar with which we constructed the bricks in order to build the Egyptian structures. Amar Abaye says, Hilchach, therefore, Abaye says, in order to satisfy both opinions, we have to make the charoses a bit tart. Kahuye means tart, and samuche means sweet. We make it a bit tart in order to remember the apples, right? Just like an apple is a bit tart. So again, we make it a bit tart in order to remember the fact that the women gave birth underneath the apple tree, and we make it thick to remember the mortar. So the Gemara says, Tanya Kavasid Rabbi Yochanan, Bryce that supports Rabbi Yochanan, Tavlin Zecher Leteben, Charoses Zecher Letit. So also interestingly enough, that in the Charoses itself you use Tavlin. Now the Rashbam points out Tavlin, Tavlin means spices, but he says you use things like cinnamon and ginger, where when you grate them, they become like a little bit like longer pieces, like straw. The idea is you use spices that look like straw inside of the charoses. Charoses, but the charoses itself is to remember the mortar. So we'll say apparently on sometime, I guess on Erev Pesach or before Pesach, Tagrei Charach. We'll say Tagrei Charach literally means the merchants who would sit by their windows. So often merchants would sit by the entranceway of their stores and I guess hawk their wares. And what would they say? Bo utlu lachem tavlin lemitzvah. They would say, come and buy for yourself spices for the mitzvah. So then when they were advertising the spices for charoses, they would make this particular announcement. So we'll say, so really fascinating. So first of all, a machlokes as to whether or not charoses is a mitzvah to begin with, right? So is charoses just a utilitarian item there to neutralize the negative effects of the maror, or is charoses an actual mitzvah itself to remember some element of the Egyptian experience? And if you say it's a mitzvah to remember some element of the Egyptian experience, what is it there to remember? Is it there to remember the fact that the Jewish woman gave birth under the apple trees? Or is it there to remember, again, some element of the shibud of the slavery over 210 years? So again, that's machlok. So we'll say, of course, if there's one thing you know about the Pesach Seder, it's that, amazingly enough, the same item could represent multiple things. And not only that, but the same item could represent what? Totally opposite things. This is the incredible part in general, right? No greater example of this than matzah. Right, so matzah goes ahead and represents lechamoni, bread of affliction, while at the same time it also represents the bread of emancipation. So pretty incredible. But I'll also just point out, Tosfos brings down over here, if you look at very quickly, if you look at Tosfos, so also listen to this, very interesting enough, Tosfos adds in, by the way, there's one more symbolism with charoses, which is we add in wine. And why do we add in wine? Zecher ladam, to remember the blood. So again, whether that's the blood of the Jewish people that was spilled, ultimately again over the course of Egyptian servitude, or the makkah of dam, or makkas bechoros, either way, but wine serves a significant symbolism in it as well. So we'll say, so again, I'm just pointing out even additional, more in Tosfos, but we'll have to go back there. So Gemara goes back there. Let's go. So Mishnah, we'll say, here we go. Mazgulo kosheni. Let's say we're up to the second cup. Very exciting. Mazgulo kosheni, the kan haben shoel, v'chan haben shoelav. And I will say it is here that the son asks his father, Vim das beben aviv melamdo. And if the son doesn't ask the question, if he doesn't know how to ask or what to ask, his father teaches him to ask, right? So the father could prod the questions, or the father could plant the questions. So I will say, in order to go ahead and ensure that this questioning occurs, Chazal built it into the Seder, right? We're nervous. What happens if somebody doesn't ask on their own? We'll proactively build it into the Seder. We'll say, here we go. Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylos, right? So why is this night different from all the nights? Shebechal halaylos anu ochlin chametzu matzah, halayla zeh kula matzah. Beautiful. So we'll say, so far so good, right? So again, every other night we eat chametzu matzah. Tonight, only matzah. Shebechal halaylos anu ochlin sha'ar yirakos. Halayla hazeh moror. Every other night we eat any vegetables. Tonight, moror. Shebachal halaylos anu ochlin basar tzali v'shalakum avushal. Halayla hazeh kulot yos. Halavai will be zoche merit Hashem to ask this question this year. We'll say, so again, every other night we eat meat however we want it prepared. However, if we want to eat it roasted, we want to eat it shalok, we want to eat it boiled or cooked. But tonight, you're only allowed to eat roasted meat. Remember again, This goes back to yesterday's daf, where we saw that the Shnei Tavshilin, right? We have 2 cooked foods at the Seder table, one for Karban Pesach and one for Chagiga. Tosfos pointed out that even Chagiga, we use an egg, for example. So you have to roast the egg, right? Why? Because Chagiga was also only consumed in a roasted fashion. Hence you see in Manashtana, we're saying tonight all meat, which means Karban Pesach and Karban Chagiga, can only be eaten if roasted. Shebachol aleilos. Ein anu chayavim l'tabel afilu pamachos. Last question. Every other night, we're not obligated to dip even once. Halayla hazeh shtei pa'amim. Yet tonight, we have to dip twice. So we'll say those are the fear kashas, right? So again, our 4 questions of the Manishtana. Ulefi daito shel ben aviv malamdo. And we'll say now again, and in accordance with the understanding of the child, the father has to teach. And I'll say, I just want to point out something so incredibly important. To have a meaningful Seder requires immense preparation. Immense preparation. A person can't roll into the Seder, open up the Haggadah and say, okay, let's go. I mean, you can, but generally, the Bala Seder is not going to create an inspirational experience for all of those assembled. If a person has young children, a person has to know their children. We'll say, understand, the entire point of the Seder is to get your children involved. So therefore, again, what that means on a practical level is sometimes less is more. The Haggadah is there as a playbook. It's not there as a Siddur where you have to daven up every single word. So sometimes that person has to understand, maybe I do a little bit more outside and a little less inside. There are certain things you have to do, which we'll discuss, but Lamaisa, the entire point of it, Lefi daito shel ben aviv malamdo. So a person has to know their kid, a person has to know their children. What do I need to do in order to go ahead and make sure that my child is engaged? And if you don't have children at your Seder, and you have adults at your Seder, and you're leading the Seder, you also have an obligation. How do I make this engaging? So if I have people around my table, and they're going to be out cold in 20 minutes if we're just reading the Haggadah, don't read the Haggadah. You could do the entire Haggadah outside, by the way. I want to point out, the Haggadah is there as a playbook. It's there, it's the teacher's manual. It's there to help you facilitate the mitzvah of Sipur. But the mitzvah is not to read every word of the Haggadah. The mitzvah is to recount the story, and the mitzvah is to see yourself as if you left Mitzrayim. The mitzvah is to relive the experience. So you have to figure out, how do you do that? But that requires incredible preparation. Incredible preparation. This is different. Well, okay, let's go back to this. The Gemara says, Ulufi daito shaman aviv melando. Maschil beginus u'mesayim b'shavach. And I both say there is a structure to the Seder. What's the structure? We begin with gnus, which literally means degradation, and we end with shavach. We end with praise. So I both say what this means is, the structure of the Seder is, we start from a low point, and we end with a high point. V'doresh me'arami oved avi at shigmos kol haparsha kula. And we begin with the section of Arami Omed Avi, right, which is again about say about Lavan trying to destroy Yaakov Avinu, and we say that entire parasha. I will say now, interestingly enough, we know this because we've seen the Seder before. Fascinatingly enough, the psukim that we go ahead and we use as the primary part of Magid are actually what we call in the Torah Mikra Bikurim. Interestingly enough, it's actually the section that you would recite when you bring first fruits to the Beis Hamikdash, which again, that section when you bring first fruits is a little bit of like a snapshot of Jewish history. It's the entirety of the Jewish experience, pretty much from Lavan, assuming that's what Arami Omed Avi means, although we'll discuss that there's a machlokes with that, Arami Omed Avi until coming to Eretz Yisrael. So when you bring Bikurim, you bring first fruits, you have to recognize those fruits are the culmination of an entire destiny, an entire history. So on Leil HaSeder, I go through that snapshot of Jewish destiny and history as well. So here we go. If my son is wise, so my son will ask me the questions on his own. And if ishto shoalto, person could have his wife ask him the question. V'im lav, hu shoal liatzmo. I will say, even if a person is by himself, ultimately, again, he asks himself the questions. So I'll say this is really quite fascinating. The obligation for the Seder to be in a question-answer format is a din in the Seder. So if your child could ask you, great. If not, your spouse could ask you. If you're by yourself, then you ask, I want to tell you something. Many of us have learned this Gemara, seen this Gemara many, many, many times. And last year was the first time that we actually saw with our own eyes that this was a Lamaisi Gemara. Because many people made Seder by themselves. Literally by themselves. And ultimately, again, the idea of Shal Es Atzmo, which is, in general, we'll say, an incredible yesod in life. That sometimes the secret to successful living is V'im Lav, if you're by yourself, Shal Yatzmo. Person always has to be asking themselves questions. In general in life, I always have to question myself. Am I doing enough? Am I doing the right thing? Am I living life in the correct way? Am I going down the right kibbutz? Am I going down the right direction? Person always has to be shoal liatzmo, an incredible yisod. Even if you have two great scholars who are making Seder together and they know everything. So we'll say, essentially what the Gemara is saying is, on Pesach night, everyone asks manishtana. Halavai, the paradigmatic example of it is, if a person is blessed with a child who could ask, then of course have the child ask. But if not, even if you're by yourself, somebody's asking manishtana, because that is the din of Leil HaSeder, to go through the Sipar Vityas Mitzrayim with questions and answers. So the Gemara goes weiter. Shebachala leilos anu matbilin pamachas halayla zeshtei pamim. So we'll say again. We asked every other night. We only dip once. Tonight we dip twice. Maskif la rava. Atu kol yoma lo sagid lo metabla chadazimna. So we'll say, interesting enough, so Rava was bothered by this, because the way the question is framed is, it sounds like every other night there's an obligation to dip once. You want to dip. You don't want to dip, don't dip. Right? So there's no obligation to dip every night once. Ela amarava hakikatani. Shebechol aleilos ein anu chayavin letabla afilu pamachas. Every other night, there's no obligation to dip even once. Halayla zeshtei pamim. Tonight you have an obligation to dip twice. The Gemara says, still we don't like that. Maskif l'Rav Safra, chiyuva l'dardiki. We'll say, remember again, why do we dip? So we'll say, so leaving aside, so at least one of the dippings we do, right? Remember we dip twice. We already spoke about this. Where do we dip twice? Right? Karpas, morer. So at least by one of those dippings, it's Kadesh Yishalu. Right? It's just in order to go ahead and get the kids to ask. So we'll say, and according to some, both are just done in order to get the kids to ask. So the Gemara says, how can you call that an obligation? Right? In other words, I'm doing things that are just an aberration from the norm in order to engender questions from the children. But why would you call that an obligation? This is what it means to say. Which I will say is the verbiage of the question as we have it today. We leave out any wording of obligation. Because the truth is, the nature of the dippings are there just to be an aberration from the norm and to engender questions. They're not really halachically motivated, right? So therefore, again, the Lasson we use is every other night, we don't even dip twice, which means I don't even have to dip twice, but tonight, I don't have to dip once, but tonight I dip twice. Beautiful. So also remember again, we begin with the Ginus, which means the degradation, the low parts of Jewish history, and we end with Shevach, we end with praise. My Ginus, so we'll say fascinating machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Here we go. My big Ginus, Rav Amar mitchila ov de avodah zara hayu avosenu. We'll say, what's the low point of Jewish history with which we begin? So Rav says that we were idol worshippers. Mitchila ov de avodah zara hayu avosenu. We'll say, who does that refer to? Mitchila ov de avodah zara hayu avosenu? Avram Avinu, the Rambam brings down, right? Avram Avinu, Hilchos Avos Chachavim. Avram Avinu was an idol worshiper. That's how he started his life. That was the family business. Mitchila of the Avodah Zarah Hayu Avosenu. We were idol worshippers. Rav says that's how we begin the Haggadah. Shmuel says Avodim Hayinu. We were slaves. A reference to the Jews in Egypt. Rabbi Soloveitchik points out that their fundamental machlokes is what type of ginus, what type of degradation do we begin with? Spiritual degradation or physical degradation? Rav says we begin with spiritual degradation. Mitchila of the avodah zara hayu avosenu, because that's the greatest ginus. Shmuel says no. Tonight is about physical degradation, and therefore avodim hayinu leparabim mitzayim. I will say now. Remember, we do them both. Right? Both of these are part of our Haggadah. Interestingly enough, we begin with Rav, right? Avodim hayinu leparabim mitzrayim, and then only later on. I'm sorry. Yeah, we begin with Shmuel. Thank you. Avodim hayinu leparabim mitzrayim, and then we go into mitchila of the avodah zara hayu avosinu. So lemaisa, we accept both opinions. build them into the Haggadah, but yet again, we go with Avadim Hayinu first because we accept Shmuel's premise that the essence of tonight, of course, is Yitzias Mitzrayim. Amar le Rav Nachman l'Daru Avdi. I will say this is great. So Rav Nachman said to Daru, his servant, Avdo demafik le mari v'cherus. If you have a servant whose master emancipated him, v'yayev le kaspa v'dava, and he gave him gold and silver, or silver and gold. My boile memar le, tell me, what does such a slave have to say to his master? So Daru, the servant, said, Amar le ba'ila aduye u'le. Such a servant has to give thanks and to praise his master. So let's listen to this. Rav Nachman said, Amarlei, Patrason milomar manishtana. We no longer have to say manishtana. So also, interestingly enough, the fact, so meaning what Rav Nachman over here engages in is a question and answer with his servant. What does a servant do when his master emancipates him and gives him gold and silver? Daru, the servant, says, shiros is ishbachos. So Nachman says, shkoyach, pasach va'amar avadim hayinu. He went on, he said, I just want to point out something amazing about these stories. Now, of course, as we mentioned before, these Seder stories are happening before the Seder is organized as we have it today, before there's a Haggadah like we have. But I just want to point out a very important takeaway message. There has to be spontaneity in your Seder. The best Seder is one in which there is spontaneity. That's what you see happening over here. Right? So Rav Nachman turns to Daru. Daru, tell me, what would you do if I emancipated you today and gave you gold and silver? I mean, I'm not going to do that. But let me just say, what would you do? What would you say? Well, say there's a spontaneity that's in it. You have to bring that spontaneity to your Seder. In the middle of a Seder, you can start with a niggin. You know, sometimes we get so structured and so rigid, which is good in certain ways. But the whole essence of the Seder is a spiritual experience. So if you're a family that sings, to burst into a niggin in the middle, and to do his odoros, you can even do a little rikud if you'd like. Right? To go ahead and make it something lively and exciting and dynamic and engaging. That's what you see happening over here in the Gemara. So Mishnah goes weiter. Rabbi Gamliel Yomer, we'll say these are incredible to learn these sugyas. Rabbi Gamliel says, the Ribono Shel Olam loves us so much. If we get to do these, I will say in the 7.5 year cycle of Shas, we could have been anywhere. Mamish anywhere, right? They could have been like Zavim and Zavas all the time. Right? They'll say, and that literally again, a week out of Pesach, Mamish, we are getting to do these sugyas, it's a matana. Rabbi Gamliel Hayo Omer, Rabbi Gamliel said, Kol Shelo Amar, Shlosha Dvarim Elu BePesach, Lo Yotzi Yedei Chavasa. Whoever did not say 3 things on Pesach has not fulfilled his obligation. I will say, now it's interesting to note that Rabbi Gamliel says his obligation. The interesting shaila is his obligation of what? What obligation are you referring to? So we'll talk about this. Ve'eluhein, here are the 3 things. Pesach, matzah, u'marer. We'll say Pesach, matzah, and marer. So Pesach, ashum, shepasach, hamakom, abatei, avosem, mitzrayim. Remember again, this is actually very interesting. Why is the Karban Pesach called Pesach? This is actually very interesting. Why is it called Pesach? Because remember again, when we were eating the Karban Pesach, what was HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing? He was skipping over our homes. This is actually very interesting. This is really feeling fascinating to think about. The entire identity of the Yom Tiv, at least from a naming perspective, is fundamentally anchored in Makas Bechoros, which is fascinating. So the eternal name of the Yom Tiv as we know it, right? You know, it's interesting. Rabbi Yitzchak Berdichev brings down, we call it Pesach, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu often refers to it as Chag HaMatzos. So he says very beautifully, each party refers to it out of a statement of love for the other. We call it Pesach because Pesach represents what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us. He skipped over our homes. HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls it Chag HaMatzos because that represents what we did for him. We left Egypt in such haste even without proper provisions. But amazingly enough, the entire identity of the Yom Tiv is anchored in the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we were sitting, eating lamb, eating shawarma, while HaKadosh Baruch Hu was visiting Makas Bechoros, the most devastating of all the plagues, upon the Egyptian homes. So he goes on, Shneimar v'amartem zeva Pesach hu Hashem asher Pasach. That's Pesach. Matzah al shum, why do we eat matzah? Al shum shenigalu avsim mitzrayim. Because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. Shneimar v'yofu es habatzik asher otzim mitzrayim. So we'll say again, we eat matzah. This is also very interesting. Remember, Rabbi Gamliel says that the identity of matzah is rooted in the fact that we left Egypt with such haste that there was no time for the dough to rise. And Rabbi says, as we mentioned before, this duality of matzah, yet a little few minutes beforehand, depending on how long your seder is, a few minutes beforehand, in halach ma'anya, we're calling matzah the bread of affliction. Nothing to do with redemption. The bread that we ate for 210 years of servitude. Next, maror al shum shemeru hamitzvah eschaya avasim mitzrayim. So we'll say, interestingly enough, out of all three of these things, maror kind of has the most straightforward identity, right? Maror is clearly there to go ahead and symbolize the bitterness of our servitude. Shene'emar vayimaru eschayehem. Incredible. So we'll say, Rabbi Gamliel says, and this is also incredibly important, because Rabbi Gamliel says pretty much everything else in the Seder is there to help facilitate Sipur, is there to help facilitate the retelling or the re-experiencing of the Egyptian narrative. But Rabbi Gamliel says there are three things which you need to do in order to satisfy your halachic obligations of the night. Pesach, Matzah, Maror. The Mishnah then goes weiter. B'chol dar v'adar chayiv adam liros es atzmo kliyatzim mitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he left Egypt. Shene'emar v'ganat lebincha bayom ahu leimar ba'avor zeh Asa Hashem li b'tzeisim mitzrayim. Suppose that this is also an incredible yesod, that the entire experience of the Seder is not simply commemorating a historical event, but rather it is commemorating a historical event in order to make it contemporarily relevant. That I have to be able to view myself as if I have left Mitzrayim. An incredible yesod. Lefichach, therefore, Nebo say, what does it mean lefichach? Therefore what? Therefore, if I view myself as if I have left Mitzrayim, right? If somehow I take the historical narrative and make it contemporarily relevant, the result of that is, lefichach, therefore, anachnu chayovim lahovdos lahala l'shabech lefar l'romi lahadu levarich la'aliyah lekalis lemi sha'asa lavosenu vilanu es kol Nisan ha'elu. So we'll say this is the progression. If I'm truly able to take a historical narrative and make it my story and bring down contemporary relevance and somehow feel as if I am able to, I've left Mitzrayim, therefore we'll say it is natural. The next step is I want to give thanks. I want to give thanks. I want to give thanks to the Ribono Shel Olam for what he did for me historically, and I want to give thanks to the Ribono Shel Olam for what he did for me contemporarily. Because tonight I am experiencing the Exodus as well. Tonight I am experiencing my freedom for all the things that enslaved me. Tonight I am having my own Yitzhak. I will say, again, the Sfarim bring down. Let's keep focused. So let's say, the Gemara says as follows, and I want to give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'misha asa lanu lavosenu v'lanu es kol Nisan ha'elu. To thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu who did for me and for my ancestors all these incredible Nisan. He took us out from servitude to freedom. Miyagon l'simcha, me'eva liyom tov, me'afeila la'argadol, mishibu l'gula. I want to say so incredibly beautiful. I want to thank the Ribono Shel Olam for everything he's done for me. You took me out from servitude to freedom, from little yagon, adversity to simcha, from mourning to yamtiv, from darkness to great light, mishibud l'geula, from servitude to redemption, v'nomar lefanav hallelujah. And as a result, I say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, thank you, and blessed be your name for all eternity, for all you have done for me. I will say, this is the essence of Yitzias Mitzrayim, to feel a sense of gratitude for everything the Ribono Shel Olam has done for me. Yitzias Mitzrayim was a big one, right? Was a big one for what he did for our nation. But the avoda of the Leil HaSeder is to cultivate a sense of gratitude. What am I thankful for that the Ribono Shel Olam has done for me? And when you could go ahead and make that list, and I think when you begin to think it's a very long list, suddenly again you fulfill Chayiv Adam Liros Es Atzmo Kilu Yatzim Mitzrayim. Because they both say we all have our Mitzrayim. Okay, now I'll tell you. Right, the Sfarim bring down. Remember again, Mitzrayim, the Shoresh of Mitzrayim is Mina Meitzar. Mina Meitzar, from the narrow straits. All of us have our narrow straits. Right, we all have our difficult circumstances. And however, we've all had periods where we've been delivered from our difficult circumstances. And if we haven't yet been delivered from our difficult circumstances, Yitzias Mitzrayim reminds us that Geula will come. Might take a little longer, might take a little shorter, but Geula always comes, and the whole yisod of Leil HaSeder is to cultivate that sense of gratitude. Ad heichon hu omer. Shavuot says, remember again, one of the interesting things we do in the Pesach Seder is we divide up Hallel. right? We do part of Hallel before the Suda, before Shulchan Orech, and part of Hallel after Shulchan Orech. Where do you stop? How much of Hallel do you say before the meal? Beis Shammai says, Ad im abonis neichot, which both says the end of the first paragraph of Hallel. So according to Beis Shammai, all you say is the first paragraph of Hallel. Beis Hillel, first wide line, Ad chalomish lamaino mayim, until the end of the second paragraph of Hallel. Okay, well, again, we'll discuss what exactly the machlokes is. V'chosim b'geula, and I both say when you close out Magid, you end with a bracha of Gula. Now the Mishnah doesn't tell us what that bracha is. We'll see in the Gemara. Tarfon Omer. So Rabbi Tarfon expounds on this a little bit, and he says, Asher ga'alanu v'ga'ala salvasinu b'mitzrayim v'lo hayachosim. So Rabbi Tarfon said, the bracha with which we end Magid is what Rabbi Tarfon calls the bracha of Asher ga'alanu. Thank you, Hashem, who has redeemed us and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt. And Rabbi Tarfon ended the bracha like that. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, or maybe Asher Hashem Zivanu, Asher ga'alanu v'ga'ala sa'osim Mitzrayim, period. Rabbi Kiva Omer, no, there's more to the bracha. So both say Rabbi Kiva agreed with Rabbi Tarfon, but he added on a little bit. Kain Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosinu. So to Hashem, our God, the God of our fathers, Yagi'enu l'moadim u'l'regalim achirim ha'bayim l'krasinu l'shalom, should help us reach appointed times, Yamim Tovim, right, that come to greet us, the Shalom, in peace, Smechim b'vinyan yirecha, v'sasem ba'avodasecha, rejoicing with the rebuilding of your city, happy in your avoda, v'nocha sham min ha'psachim u'min ha'zvochim, ad baruch atah Hashem ga'al Yisrael. Both say, if it sounds familiar, incredibly enough, the bracha we say to this very day is the bracha of Rabbi Akiva. Both say, how incredible is that when we sit at our Seder, I will say the same bracha of Asher Ga'alanu that Rabbi Akiva, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh Levracha, said at his Seder. Also, I will just point out something very interesting. At many a Seder, when you get to that phrase, Min Azvachim, Min Apsachim, I don't know if your Seder is like mine. Generally, there's someone, you'll say Min Azvachim, Psachim, and then of course this, usually that one uncle, no, Min Apsachim, Min Azvachim. We see every year, Min Apsachim, Min Azvachim. So I just want to point out, this is actually very shaykh for this year. The normal order of it is Min Azvachim u Min Apsachim. The Zevach refers to the Karban Chagiga, Pesach refers to the Karban Pesach, because in a normal year, first you eat your Karban Chagiga, and then you eat your Karban Pesach. The one time we switch the order is this year. When Seder falls out on Motzei Shabbos, the proper order is Min HaPsachim u Min HaZvachim. Because remember again, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, we don't offer up the Karban Chagiga. Right? The Chagiga is not Docha Shabbos. Only the Pesach is Docha Shabbos. So in a regular year, it's Min HaZvachim, Min HaPsachim, because first you're in the Chagiga, then the Pesach. When Motzei Shabbos is the first Seder, the proper order is Min HaPsachim and Min HaZvachim. Again, we keep Zvachim in there, even though when Pesach falls on Motzei Shabbos, there was no Karban Chagiga. So you would eat your Pesach. That's pretty much what you have. Pesach would be your main meal. Beautiful. Says, just go a little bit weiter. Amar Rava, Tzarech sheyomar va'osanu hotzi misham. So what's actually very interesting. Rava says, you have to say the phrase, and Hashem has taken us out from Egypt. So both say, it's not immediately clear where Rava is saying to insert that phrase. Is he saying that goes into the bracha of Asher Ga'alanu? It goes somewhere else? Okay, we'll have to see. The point that Rava is making is, once again, a person must make a declarative statement that says, I was taken out. Meaning, once the Gemara says that a person is obligated to see themselves as if they left Mitzrayim, Rav is just adding in, by the way, you have to say, Va'osanu hotzim. You have to make that declarative statement that Hashem took us out. So we'll say, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem with another statement of Rav tomorrow. Shkoyach.